Okay, friends, so this is the sixth video lecture on the topic of adolescence, and we have moved to the portion of the topic covering emotional development. In the last video lecture, we ended up talking about cognitive development, and now I want to move into social and emotional development. So you may remember from previous lectures, from previous chapters, when we talked about the theorist Erik Erikson. And Erik Erikson's model is the idea that that as we come of age, we go through these different stages and we have these different crises, and then how we reconcile those crises. So one of the other ones was like trust versus mistrust, and we also had like industry versus inferiority or something like that. In adolescence, teenage years, the topic is, or the crisis is, identity versus role confusion. So we have a lot of discussion in emotional development literature about how teenagers come to develop their sense of self, their identity. The goal of this stage is what we call fidelity, and fidelity is committing to an identity. But before we get to commit to identity, there are different stages. So they talk about status, they talk about identity development statuses, and the idea is that in order to successfully settle on an identity, a person goes through these different stages. Well, yeah, so you got one of them, or they could be at one of these different statuses of identity formation. So you have identity diffusion, which is where one settles, one has not experienced any identity. So going back to like the first part of this chapter, when we were talking, or when I was talking about how adolescence is a time of opportunities and risks. It's a time of opportunity to explore, to develop one's identity, but there's also some risks involved with trying out new things. So this goes along with how a young person settles on their identity. So one of them would be, which would be the less risky, would be identity diffusion. And this is when a person doesn't really explore different identities and they really make no commitment. They just kind of go with whatever. You have identity foreclosure, and this is where a young person just settles on wherever they happen to be, whatever their parents maybe tell them, but they have not explored anything. And this one wouldn't necessarily be the richest way of coming to understand oneself. Identity moratorium, and this is where a young person is exploring different things, right? So they're trying to figure out how they are, they're trying new things, they dress different, hang out with different people, haven't settled. And then finally, the last stage, or the last status, is sort of the goal, and this is identity achievement, which means I've tried lots of different things, and I have decided this is who I am, and we come to settle on sort of an identity. Other elements of identity formation may have more to do with other people. So this is what we call our social identity. So we come to not the question still is who I am, but the question is who I am, which groups do I belong to? So your book lists some examples, and I'm going to talk about two elements of social identity formation more in depthly. But just sort of broadly, like one example of social identity is religious identity, because religion is the religious group you belong to is obviously a social group, right? So most young people will go with something similar to the religion that they were raised. According to our textbooks, only a small percentage of young people completely abandon their religious identity altogether. Sometimes I think about the friends that I grew up in. They spent a period of their young adulthood where they rejected all elements of their religious identity, but when it came time to have their own kids, they came back to their religious identity. So it's not all that common to completely abandon. Political identity is sort of the same thing. Increasingly, according to our textbooks, people are not identifying with a political party. and it's not at all uncommon. In sociology, we talk about social reproduction. This is an example of social reproduction. This is an example of young people learning the ways of their parents and simply repeating that. Vocational identity is like what your career path is. Once upon a time, I would say for a couple generations, you took on the same occupation as your parents. You came out of high school, you had an internship or an assistantship or that's not the word I'm looking for, but basically an apprenticeship, and you remained in that. Now more people are spending time in college. At least that was that was the case a decade ago. It's still sort of up in flux after COVID about the role of college. Gender identity, I want to talk more at length about in the next slide. And then ethnic identity. Ethnic identity is something I don't see in all my textbooks, but it's the idea that one's ethnic heritage, one's cultural heritage. So ethnicity and race are not the same thing, but they are related, but they're not the same thing. So we're talking about like one's cultural background, one's heritage, where people, maybe your religion, maybe your culture, maybe what you eat, right? And this model is similar to what we were talking about in that previous slide, where for some people, specifically like white people, like myself, white Protestants who have I'm a member of the dominant ethnic group. I don't really consider my ethnic background because it's just never salient to me. I'm never aware of it. But individuals who are members, say, of Muslim communities or non-dominant ethnic groups, maybe recent immigrants to the United States, maybe refugees, they are more aware, more salient of their ethnic identity because it is not part of the dominant group. So it is I'm at stage one. I've not examined my ethnic heritage at all. There's no reason for me to do so because I have what sociologists call privilege. I have white privilege. I have never needed to. I never feel like it draws attention to myself. But if I were a member of an ethnic group that dressed different, perhaps covered my hair, perhaps spoke a different language, perhaps I couldn't find the food that my culture, my preferred food in a grocery store, this would be reason for me to examine my ethnic heritage. So the second stage is when one is aware or has reason to examine their ethnic heritage and has considered, like, how do my parents' ethnic background fit in with this larger dominant background? Do I consider myself, say, a Ukrainian or a German or from some other part of the country, or do I consider myself an American? And in the what assimilation, oh god, I gotta be careful with my words, but in sort of this assimilation literature, these struggles are often more significant for they would be second generation. They would be the children of the immigrant families who have to sort of figure out how to integrate, how to sort of integrate their own ethnic identity. And then the third is when one has considered, or even what if you are born, you are a child of, say, a German and an American, or I'm just thinking of the people that I know. I have a friend, I guess she's Ukrainian and he's an American, and their children, right? How do they identify? What elements of their ethnic background are they embracing? But the third one then is achieved, and this is similar. This is basically the same idea. You have diffusion, you're exploring, and the third. Okay, I'm going to stop here, and in the next video lecture, I'm going to talk more about the specific. I'm going to talk about gender identity and the process of establishing one's gender identity.